Secretary King, thank you so much for being here. This is a wonderful opportunity where we think we're onto something here. You know, you've worn a lot of hats. You're a parent, you're an educator, a social studies teacher. You've been a school founder, administrator. You've been a civil servant. You've been U.S. Secretary of Education. Talk about how those experiences are shaping your perspective today.
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to join you. Look, I think most profoundly, my views as an educator were shaped by my experience as a student. Growing up, both my parents were educators, but they passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. And in the period when it was just my dad and me, my dad was struggling with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So home was incredibly difficult, unstable, scary a lot of the time. The thing that saved me was school. Great public school teachers who made school a place that was safe and compelling and nurturing. And that really shaped my decision to become a teacher and principal and to pursue a career in education and education policy. And as an educator, I've always been very focused on issues of equity. And I think the reality is, as a country, despite our aspirations around democracy and equality, we have fallen short and continue to fall short in providing equitable opportunities to low-income students and students of color. And that's been the focus of my work. And one of the things I'm struck by and contemplating a lot in the context of COVID is the degree to which we have allowed those inequities to remain. For many folks who have privilege, they're not necessarily even aware of those inequities. You know, we saw that when COVID hit and people suddenly realized there were so many families that didn't have internet or didn't even have a device for their students to use. Or the resource disparities between our schools. Some schools were able to provide a ton of professional development support to teachers as soon as COVID hit, and others really struggled. And so, you know, I continue to have this tremendous sense of urgency around closing those equity gaps and try to stay hopeful that this moment, this national crisis around COVID and the national reckoning around race after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor have provided an opportunity for us to turn the conversation into action and actually finally begin to address some of these longstanding challenges.
You know, we're a very large college of education. We prepare thousands of teacher candidates every year. And I'm wondering, right, how do we take this opportunity to really think about what we do and how that education workforce that we prepare needs to change to get closer to this equity goal?
We've got to diversify the teaching profession. You know, majority of kids in our nation's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. It is critically important for students of color, for Black students, Latino students, Asian American students, Native American students, to be able to see themselves reflected in our education workforce. But I also think it's critical for white kids to get to see a diverse community of educators supporting their learning. So that's an urgent need that you're particularly well positioned to address. 2, we've got to really think differently about how we approach teaching and learning to ensure that there are equitable opportunities for all students. Too often we know low-income students and students of color get less access to well-rounded education, less access to social studies and science and art and music, less access to advanced placement classes, dual enrollment opportunities, high quality career and technical education. So really I think about how do we make sure all students can access the kinds of things we would want for our own kids. A third, I think, important area of focus is diversifying the content of our curriculum, making sure that students gain an appreciation for the truth of our history, the hard parts of our history, slavery, segregation, Japanese American internment, our kind of cyclical anti-immigrant sentiment in this country. I mean, those are important areas for students to understand from our history, and then try to think through how do we tackle some of those issues that remain in our society today, some of those systemic challenges that remain. And excellent education needs to be broad, give students an appreciation for the beauty of music, for physical and mental health, and has to provide environments that are supportive of students' socio-emotional well-being. How do we help students acquire the skills that will help them be successful in college and careers, the kind of self-management skills that they'll need, but also the relational skills? How do we help them think about working in teams? How do we help them build collaborative relationships? How do we help them see the world from someone else's perspective? And so there are many elements of socio-emotional skills that I think we now know we need to attend to more in teacher and principal preparation. And that's important work ahead for the sector.
Our work here has been centering on bringing teams of educators with distributed expertise into these learning environments so that we can provide all students with this kind of deeper and personalized learning. So everything that you're talking about here, right, is top of mind for us. And the question is for us, then how do we prepare educators who can do all of that? And then we say, okay, it can't be one person who can do all of that. So how do we start to think very differently about teacher preparation, about what we do, about professional learning, about roles that people play?
Certainly that's right. I mean, I think we do need to think about school communities, and as teams, we have to think about how we build a team of adults around a student that may include school personnel, it may include outside school personnel. I think about the importance of mentoring programs, of after school and summer experiences. The important thing is that young people have powerful, positive relationships with adults who are helping them acquire the skills that they will need for long-term success. That said, I think we also have to do work to develop the systems in schools that support the successful operation of those teams. I think about one of our Investing in Innovation grantees during the Obama administration called Building Assets, Reducing Risk, an initiative that began with a school counselor in Minnesota who went to her principal with the realization that they might be able to help students do better if they just had time built into their schedule for the adults working with students, the team of teachers and school counselor and so forth, had time to meet and talk through individual students and to look at both their assets, their strengths, the things they're passionate about, and the students who were most in danger of getting off track. And that team then could figure out, how do we leverage those assets, and how do we make sure that there's someone on the team who's intervening with any student who seems like they're getting off track. And what she showed, what Angie Jerebick showed at Building Assets, Reducing Risk, is that she was able to significantly improve academic outcomes, attendance, and graduation rates in randomized controlled trials at scale, not just in one school or one district, but across multiple districts, through creating that team environment. But it required real intentionality about managing the schedule of the school day and the job descriptions of the team members.
In 2018, there was a Phi Delta Kappa poll, public's attitude towards public schools, right, that showed for the first time in the survey's history, parents are not recommending their kids become teachers. As a matter of fact, we see in our juniors, when they get out to do their internships, many teachers are telling our teacher candidates, don't, get out now, which is highly problematic, right? And so, the question is, why do we think this is the case? What are the biggest implications of this? And what are the opportunities that you see?
Yeah. Well, two very concrete challenges, and then one that is more cultural. So at a very concrete level, we need to pay people better. Teacher compensation remains a huge challenge, variable across the country, even across states. But we aren't paying people at a level that is competitive with folks with similar education in our economy. And that makes it hard. When you see teachers who have to work 2 jobs, 3 jobs in order to make ends meet, that is not sustainable. So we've got to improve teacher compensation. 2, we've got to improve working conditions. Is the copier working Are there enough school counselors in the building? We know in some states, the ratio of students to school counselors is 400 to 1 or more. Whether or not people have collaborative planning time with their colleagues, whether or not they are able to get the classroom resources they need for labs or for projects, whether or not they're able to take field trips, whether or not their kids have access to meals. All those different elements play into the working conditions. The harder piece, even if we solve compensation and working conditions, is the broader cultural question. Do we have a culture that says teaching is a valued profession? When I was secretary, I went to visit Singapore, and I was struck that in Singapore, everyone, military leaders, business leaders, political leaders, everyone across sectors will tell you the most important profession in Singapore is teacher, because they understand that their future depends on human capital and their ability to educate students as well as possible to compete in the 21st century and beyond. We don't have that mindset as a country. We don't lift up the teaching profession. We don't celebrate teachers the way that we should. We don't convey a sense of value about the teaching profession the way we should. And that cultural shift, in some ways, is harder to achieve than the resources to address compensation and working conditions, but it's critically important.
Yeah. We have t-shirts that say world's most important profession. Mm-hmm. And at graduation every year, I keep saying, we have 400 and some majors on this campus. They're all great, right? We need our, our engineers and our accountants and our whatever. And the fact is, none of them would be here if it weren't
for
teachers, right?
That's exactly right.
None of them would be sitting here. So hundreds of thousands of students every year that are sitting in universities, they wouldn't be here without teaching. Mm-hmm. Where is the policy shift in all of this? We talk lots about local control, and I've always thought a lot of this could happen, right? If we have the will to really do it. But there's clearly politics, there's clearly policy, and investment that probably needs to be made. And you've seen, this kind of, investment, good investment, bad investment. I'm just wondering how you think about that today, as we're seeing lots of things happening right now.
I think there is some good momentum. I think about some of the policy changes that states were making or talking about making even before COVID. Major school funding reform in Texas, major school funding reform in Massachusetts. We passed in Maryland major school funding reform package over the governor's veto this spring because the General Assembly is committed to getting more resources, particularly to our highest need schools. So there was some good political momentum before COVID. I think COVID has created some challenges, certainly around the economic crisis that COVID has brought. But the infusion of additional federal dollars, I think, has got people thinking about, well, now with these new federal resources, like the American Rescue Plan dollars, what more could we and should we be doing for our kids? And I'm hopeful that will create a long-term shift where we say, those aren't just COVID recovery issues, those are long-term issues. We've got to invest more in early childhood education. We've got to invest more in school counselors and mental health services. We've got to invest more in mobilizing additional supports for our students who are furthest behind and additional learning time for our students who are furthest behind. I'm hopeful that there is this shift. I also think that economic pressures continue to grow. And the reality is there just aren't that many jobs you can do today that will provide a family sustaining wage without a meaningful post-secondary credential. And I think that that's putting a lot of attention on K-12 and post-secondary to make sure that students have the skills they need to compete in a more challenging economy.
We're really challenging this one classroom, one teacher model and wondering, how do we start to incentivize that? Because that is a working condition issue. Mm-hmm. That's where we think we could make a tremendous difference, is starting to break down that model.
I think there are some opportunities, particularly with these new resources, as we think about COVID recovery, to try some things that would be quite different. I think about Saga, which is a tutoring program, operates in Chicago and a number of cities. Saga puts well-trained tutors into the math classroom to to work with students individually or in pairs or even in small groups. Those tutors are using high quality materials. They're in the classroom all year long. They build a sustained relationship with students. And the evidence for Saga is that they can have, again, in randomized controlled trials, a statistically significant positive impact on student math achievement. That's very encouraging. I hope some folks will use some of the American Rescue Plan dollars to try out different models of high intensity tutoring. We have good evidence that high intensity tutoring works, but we need to learn the different ways that we can deploy that tutoring to address reading, to address math, to address science and social studies, so forth. I also think about dual enrollment, where you've got high school teachers and college faculty working together to design courses that help bridge high school with college and get students a head start on an associate's degree or even a bachelor's degree. Those kinds of opportunities that expand what students can accomplish within K-12 really make that team environment as impactful as possible.
I'm wondering what you're seeing and whether or not people are taking advantage of this moment in time around opportunity. The big things aren't happening. And I just wonder what you're seeing and then what other barriers are to really moving and changing these systems and structures and really moving out of this sort of typical, egg carton model of schooling.
I think that the challenge we have as a sector now is to both kind of turn down the noise on some of the distracting politics, focus on the impact that COVID has had, both academic and socio-emotional on students, and figure out what are the interventions that we can design based on evidence, and then how will we evaluate the impact of those interventions over time so that we can learn not only about COVID recovery, but where we should be better investing our resources over the long term.
What are the considerations you think that we need to take into account as we're designing these new staffing models that are better for learners, better for educators, more sustainable, I think, for education systems? Lots of things that we're talking about around counselors, around tutors, around all the things here that you're talking about, all these different people. I mean, they're all part of the team, right? We're not relying on one person anymore. We can't possibly. And so whether or not that's, after school, before school, during school, what's a team look like, grade level teams around groups of kids, integrated content teams around kids, that, people that just, again, have more eyes and ears on what's going on with kids and are really, really focused on thinking about, putting the learner at the center of what's happening in schools. And so, I'm just wondering what you think we should be considering, what that looks like today, particularly for colleges of education, but also for school districts and others who we partner with.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges is getting to the nuance. School counselors end up assigned a whole lot of activities that aren't necessarily at the core of supporting students' socio-emotional needs. So how are we thinking about school counselor preparation in a way that helps counselors stay focused on the things that are most important? And how are we changing principal preparation so that principals are attentive to leveraging their school counselors in the right ways, right? So that school counselors are providing support to students and families around socio-emotional needs and not spending all of their time on scheduling or lunch supervision or any of the many activities that oftentimes get in the way for school counselors. When we're thinking about the design of the role of tutors or academic support folks in a school, are we making sure that they're well trained, that they're getting strong, high quality materials, that their work is coordinated with the school? If you've got an after school program with really great tutors, but they're not in communication with the teachers during the school day, that's going to be less than maximally productive. And so you've got to both prepare the tutors to think about collaboration with the classroom teachers and prepare classroom teachers to think about collaboration with after school providers and tutors. Thinking about the teams, what kinds of information should teachers be sharing regularly with each other to make the teams effective. There's a discipline to looking at student work together and really digging into why is this student struggling and what supports do they need. And ideally, you would have the teachers who are working with that student, a special educator maybe working with that student, a counselor maybe working with that student, all together looking at that student's work and analyzing what their needs are. Those are different experiences than we've usually emphasized in the preparation of teachers. Even something like working with families. When I was a principal, one of the things I was struck by was that oftentimes, especially with young teachers, they have really no preparation in how to work with families. And so when I became a principal, I was very systematic about saying, let's role play how conversations might go with parents. Let's talk about how do you talk with a parent about their child struggling academically or socially? How do you take feedback from a parent that may be hard to hear based on their kid's experience of your class? We built that into our training of teachers when I was a principal, but I don't think we've yet systematically made family engagement as central as it should be in teacher preparation and principal preparation.
We've convened a group of educators who are thinking about what happens at the micro level between educators and students and at the macro level within education systems. So we've got a broad audience of folks here. And they will spend the next day and a half thinking about how to move all of this forward. What do you think they should be keeping foremost in their minds?
Too often, I think, in our sector, we start with the affluent white general education student as our paradigm. And then somebody in the meeting says, well, what about English learners? Or what about African-American students? Or what about students with disabilities? And I think that's exactly backwards. We should actually start with the students who historically we've served the least well. And if we design systems that will work for them and be successful for them, actually the affluent general ed white student will be just fine, right? But so we have to think in our design about how are we making this work for the students who most desperately need something different from our systems than what we've done in the past. That's one. Two, work on integrating the academic with the socio-emotional is always critical, but after COVID and the impact that's had, especially critical. I mean, you think about kids, we have thousands of kids who've lost a parent to COVID. We have many students across the country whose parents lost their jobs, who had to move homes, who had periods of food insecurity because of the economic crisis that COVID created. Many young people who were missing a lot of school and isolated from those relationships with peers and teachers that are so powerfully important. I mean, I see it with my daughters who have tremendous privileges, but last year not having in-person school was really hard. And they really missed the social elements of school. And that's really taken a toll on kids. And so we really have to think about this as a period of reconnection for kids this school year, but more broadly over the long term, how we're going to better address socio-emotional needs. When we're thinking about the design of a project or a task, we should be thinking about the academic goals and the socio-emotional goals. When we think about the construction of the school schedule or the teams of educators around students, we should be thinking both about academic goals and socio-emotional goals. How do we make sure that we are building school environments and education policy environments that are about continuous learning? There are a lot of initiatives taking place in every school district. We often don't spend as much time thinking about, did the initiative work? How do we know? What about it didn't work? What lessons can we draw? And how do we use that information to inform what we do next? And that element of data analysis and continuous improvement really can help us get better at using our resources well and serving our students effectively. So I hope folks will think about how do we shift our culture towards a continuous improvement culture.
Thank you so very much for doing this. We really, really appreciate this. And I know our audience also appreciates it and will take to heart all these wise words. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.